All right, welcome to Varn Blog, and today we have Ross Wolfe with us. Hey, Ross, what you been up to lately?
Not too much. For the most part, I've been keeping busy, working a lot. I don't, and people might know me from my blog, The Charnel House, which I don't update as regularly as I used to, which is fine, whatever. But I do still occasionally write, usually for small left communist outlets, but sometimes more mainstream publications. So I've written for Paul Maddox's field notes sections of the Brooklyn Rail, Lauren Goldner's Insurgent Notes, as well as book reviews for Los Angeles Review of Books, Marxism and Philosophy with Amog, who you know, and the Theory Journal Mediations. I contributed several pieces and helped edit a couple issues of Intransigence, which was a short-lived effort at aiming at regroupment of the communist left. It's since been succeeded by 1919, which looks really cool. So I encourage people to check that out. I also wrote an essay on abstract art last year for Cured Quail, which was edited by the brilliant E.J. Russell. And I've had architectural criticism published in Eflux, Metropolis, the Architect's newspaper. And the last thing I had was this long historical piece on the God building debate in among the Bolsheviks, like in like the 1900s, early 1900s, which I've been asked to expand into a book, but we'll see. We'll see where that leads. But that's pretty much. I mean, apart from working, which I know you're also a teacher, so you've been keeping busy.
Yeah, I'm a department head actually as of this year. So,
oh wow, even more responsibilities.
Sort of, yeah. It's mostly just more paperwork, but so I wanted to talk to you about the state of the left. But before we even got to that, we are going to talk about an article by Paul Matique, Back to the Future, and then an American Affairs article, actually, which is a pre-Bernie bombing article, but one that I think built a strategy of addressing the post-Bernie problem that I have found interesting and somewhat problematic. So they're two very different approaches, though. Obviously, I think we're both more sympathetic to the Matique approach. But I just wanted to, go over a little bit that you and I have been talking about left stuff with a break of about half a decade, actually.
Going way back
since before Occupy. We actually met each other. I met you in New York during Occupy, during the end of the Zuccotti Park stuff when it got cold.
You were visiting, I think, like from Korea or something.
I was, yeah. So we've known each other a while, and we both have had parallel interactions with various trot and post-trot groups, as well as left communist groups. And I have found that the Trump years, before we even get to this Bernie stuff, were a particularly lean period for left communism, even though like Bordega and all these left communist figures became kind of almost meme jokes online. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, I mean, there was like interest that had sort of bubbled up. I mean, you were part of it, I think, on online circles. I certainly became exposed to various, left communist authors around 2013, 2014. And then, but yeah, as, the Trump, I mean, they kind of went hand in hand, though, because there was also, the Bernie 2016 campaign, which this and the mass migration of leftists of all different stripes, Trotskyists, even anarchists and, even sort of communizer types on the West Coast to join the DSA as part of this sort of post-2016 Bernie moment of forming various caucuses. This was always an approach that I felt was, unfortunate and misguided and, I think, panned out further. We're seeing really the kind of aftermath of all of these, failed, efforts to, situate themselves vis-a-vis Bernie and Corbyn in the UK. It was an interesting thing I found in reading the piece by Amber was it was pre-Corbyn implosion too. It was before the UK election in 2019, so it was still even hopeful of in terms of the possibility of him getting elected, but anticipating the kind of problems that she saw as part of the Corbyn coalition being similar to problems she saw in the Bernie coalition. We can talk about the extent to which we agree or disagree with her analysis and the extent to which it prefigures the kind of post-left or whatever you want to call it rhetoric that we've seen more recently. But maybe now that the Bernie and Corbyn moments have passed, there will be more interest in left communism or whatever, but who knows what the future will hold.
I mean, well, the Corbyn moment was particularly interesting, and maybe we can debrief a little bit about that before we get into the articles too. I remember being somewhat surprised that the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee, the Mike McNair, Jack Conrad group, was so sanguine on Corbyn entryism after the left unity regroupment had failed. I mean, McNair had criticisms which he apparently held until after the loss of Corbyn, but it was clearly a strategy even of groups that I had associated with pretty staunch opposition to Labour. And so this sort of entryist trend seemed ubiquitous. But what I also found interesting, now admittedly, we're not using a strict Marxist definition of working class, particularly when we come to Britain, because there's this quasi-medieval class tradition that still is how they do a lot of their demography. But if you look at the classic working class voters for Labour, they actually followed, even under Corbyn, the same trends as the voting did for the Democrats in the United States. And that's a new development that really only started, that Americanization of the voting patterns in the UK really only started about 10 years ago, after the end of the Blairite period, right? So you started seeing that development. Corbyn didn't shift that at all. So if you look at his actual micro demographics, it was urban, poor, young people, and professionals who made over a fair amount of money. And then you had pensioners in the rural areas, and rural urban divides being the primary voting indicators, as opposed to Labour and Tories being voted more along class lines, which have been the history in the UK, most of the 20th century, no matter, even during the beginnings of New Labour, So
yeah, I mean, I saw some parallels, but in terms of American politics versus British politics, I always used to think of, and I still do, I guess, think of Blair as a kind of Clinton figure. I don't know. And, insofar as, there really wasn't that much separating a Clinton and a Bush, the fact that Blair continued to collaborate, so closely with the Bush administration after Clinton left office wasn't a big surprise to me. But yeah, that the parallels between the Bernie and Corbyn moment were, unexpected to me. I, wouldn't have expected this kind of general social democratic mood at all. 10 years, 2006, when I was in the anti-war movement and all this stuff, a figure like Bernie or Corbyn seemed unimaginable to me. But yeah, their failures to kind of pick up votes, and to sway the kind of to do, I mean, I guess Corbyn did have that moment of doing unexpectedly well in 2017, just as Bernie had did unexpectedly well in the primary of 2016. We can, analyze why they did so much more poorly in 2019 and 2020, respectively. Certainly like Amber and others seem to have their line of reasoning. Certainly Angela Nagel and others wrote a sort of a postmortem on the Bernie campaign of 2020 that perhaps incorporates some of this analysis. It's interesting. I mean, I'm someone who never really supported Bernie or Corbyn. I considered both of them far too moderate. So I really didn't have a horse in the race. But it was interesting to some extent seeing the left try and grapple with this sort of collapse of what they had, pinned their hopes to.
Yeah, so I guess this brings us to the Paul Matique article, because there's a way in which now that the Trump fever dream is kind of well and beginning to fade, even in conservative circles, there's already beginning to be grumblings of some kind of post-Trump future. I find it very fascinating that we don't really have a good understanding of what the left role in all this was. In 2016, I was doing a postmortem for the first Bernie campaign as the DSA was beginning to just start exponentially growing in numbers. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying that if they're not careful, they're going to revitalize a morbid center that doesn't really deserve to live by the appearance of left movement. And they might get some concessions out of that, but at a cost, and they're not going to pay attention to the cost, they being the general left. And I actually thought that might even happen, even if Bernie was to win in 2020. Like, if he was to run again, because that was still an open question at the time. And while I feel somewhat vindicated, I still don't think I understand exactly what has happened, because what I see immediately on the left is this kind of grappling with self-understanding, some of which actually veers towards trying to explain things with a class analysis that, people who've listened to the channel know that I find somewhat incoherent in the way it's stated, and going all the way back to Barbara Ehrenreich. So I found Matique's article about the kind of shadow side of this Biden stuff to be interesting, particularly the way in which the military development has not gone away, even though we are finally beginning to accept that Afghanistan, after, you and I, our entire adult lives have been spent in the shadow of Afghanistan. I started protesting it when I was 21 years old, and I'm 40. I
was like 14 when I went to protest like that. And then, even more so, I threw myself much more into the Iraq protest. But yeah, I thought that what's interesting, and what's kind of been a constant in this sort of Democratic Party imaginary, I guess, including Bernie, especially in the 2020 campaign, is, I guess in 2016, like he still, he has that big poster of Eugene Debs or whatever, was trying to cast himself as a kind of throwback socialist, broad populist appeal, talking about the banks or whatever. In 2020, he seemed to be hearkening back more to the kind of FDR New Deal moment, which of course, like you and I remember, like even when Obama was as pitiful as his domestic, policies agenda even stated on his campaign website was, like there were like covers of the New Yorker, I think, showing Obama like in the, in a motorcade, with a huge with one of those like cigarettes held out of the, basically cast as FDR, like promising a sort of New Deal, like basically Keynesian countercyclical spending in order to alleviate the crisis of 2008, because as Matty, like he points out, like as insofar as there was this sort of post-war boom, this sort of Keynesian period, the miracle of growth from like 45 through the early 70s, 71, 72, and then the oil crisis, of course, and then followed by the kind of the triumph of Austrian school Hayekian economics, basically from 73 to on both sides of the aisle, both major bourgeois political parties in the United States, certainly, and around the globe. Mitterrand in France, elected by a coalition of socialists and communists, enacted austerity in 1981. So it wasn't just Reagan, it wasn't just Thatcher, it was even, the institutional left. The fact that even, somebody like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, like the, head of the IMF, belonged to a socialist party should, tell you like how empty, this signifier had become by that time. So neoliberalism was ascendant, and basically the economic ideologies that undergirded that, as Medic points out, after 2008, it should have been discredited. Mm-hmm. But Keynesianism too, had led to stagflation in the 70s. Like it did not offer a way out of capitalism's, crisis-prone tendencies. Like it led to, the crisis of the 70s. And I found it interesting because it became kind of a meme ideology, especially with Yang, who, in New York, I'm still hearing a lot about Yang because he's running for mayor. But, his UBI proposal, just like print money till, to just print as much money as we want to solve all of our problems. It's interesting that MMT, didn't sort of step in and fill that void, left by Keynesianism on the one hand, and Hayekianism, or Austrian school free market bullshit on the other. And really, Maddox pointing out, the sort of long-term decline in capitalist profitability, really undermines, any of these sort of proposed ideological solutions. Like none of the policies really make any sense, and really, for all of his talk of economic nationalism and so on, Trump really, didn't do that much that was different from Obama or, Bush or any of them. Really, and Biden is continuing in large part the same policies, certainly along the border, in terms of military spending, despite his, promise to get us out of Afghanistan, which, I'll believe it when I see it. Really, the sort of powerlessness of these, massive government agencies and, the most powerful people in the world in the face of the economic constraints that, they're confronted with, that's what I found most interesting about Maddox's article, and his throwing that in the face of the various, left-wing outlets that have sort of, lauded him as, our FDR, or as a radical, as Ezra Klein, called him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as a person writing a book on Christopher Lasch, which I find very fascinating, Lasch's resurgence and a lot of people's thought, I am amused by the fact that so many of both the populist post or anti-left quote Marxist, and I don't think they're that Marxist-y when I really look at what they actually advocate and how they think. And the kind of half of the Bernie Sanders coalition, even the class unity kind of people, they tend to avoid the underlying economic propulsions in a way that even, say, something like MMT, which neither you or I are completely copacetic with, doesn't. So you get ideological explanations, or even class explanations that are kind of removed from the cycle of production and even ownership, You see this drawing up of the bourgeoisie as essentially an absentee landlord over the entirety of society in a lot of these PMC discussions, whether or not they're Amber Frost or the more rightish post-left and even post-liberal right-wingers who've adopted some of the same language, from Patrick Deneen to, I guess, Michael Lind, who is not a right-winger exactly, but when you're a Democrat, when you're arguing, against socialists and stuff, and you were a Republic even after you left the American Enterprise Institute, it's hard for me to believe that some of that's still not there. And I say this as a former right winger, so I see a lot of this right now, and it does seem to be the shock of having no real answer to the foreign policy conundrums. If you think about the kinds of discussions of foreign policy we see, even in the anti-imperialist left, in quotation marks, right? You have a lot of standing for a lot of naivete around China's involvement in Africa. You have basically this idea of the imperial hegemon being kind of unilaterally powerful, despite the fact that we're literally living in a time period where it is clear to me that what's propulsing a lot of this foreign policy stuff is not even ideology. And I'll give you an example of that, and it's in the Matique article. Biden's pivot towards China is a slightly differently branded version of a similar policy change that came during the Trump administration. And a lot of that to me has to do with the fact that China is also beginning to enact its own agenda. I would say actually a regionally somewhat imperialist one.
I would agree.
That, at least proto-imperialist one. That is worrying to the United States, not for any reasons of liberty or anything like that, but because they, I think, are beginning to realize they are in relation to China what they being us, what we were in relation to the UK, or no, excuse me, reverse that. What the UK was in relation to us 100 years ago. So if you look at production capacity, like we surpassed the UK's production capacity about 20 years before the empire fell. I mean, it's not a perfect, and whenever you make these historical analogies, you can make them too clean and too perfect, and they aren't that as clean as I might be presenting it here, but the parallels are actually pretty clear. What my friend Jim Bajalan has said about this and what you've seen on the left is this retreat into either FDRism or into Dengjiism, which is both actually kind of wanting a Bonapartist figure that actually represents the developmental stage of kind of the past to come in and step in and, basically take, fix the class war for them, fix the political situation for them. Now, I think that's interesting. I mean, it's as interesting as the PMC thesis anyway, but it doesn't really get to what's going on. What are we seeing with Biden? And I think one of the things we're seeing with Biden is an attempt at a Neo-Fordist compact, which a lot of the kind of social democratic left, would actually like. They tend to, when they talk about socialism and they talk about FDR, there tends to be a kind of projection of the post-war pack back into the 30s, right? Which wasn't the case. And what they're really thinking about is like Eisenhower to the beginning of the Great Society period under LBJ, ignoring that you had proto-neoliberalization under JFK, because, boomer trauma, they don't look at that. But for me, you just have this march of history that doesn't look at the changes of the economy in a very real way. One of the biggest ones is MMT, for example, as its answer to the Keynesian paradigm, right? And I think I have been telling leftists to take MMT seriously and interrogate it, but there seems to be a popularity in part of it amongst actual policymakers, and the part that the policymakers tend to be interested in is the maintaining of quantitative easing and of a 0% interest rate. And it seems to me that very few people have been speaking about this massive expansion of a rentier class. I mean, even in where's all this liquidity going to go? It's not going into the open market. It might begin to now, and unfortunately, that's going to show up as inflation. But where's it going to go? Well, it's going to go. Eventually, people are going to take. Well, we can't just infinitely pump up like paper assets forever without something piercing it. Let's throw it into real assets, i.e., property, and you're going to see the massive buying out of an understocked housing supply. It was already understocked. You're going to see the rents go up, except in the major cities. Actually, ironically, in the super hot spots, like where like you live in New York and like California. But what you're seeing is an equalization towards that in the rest of the country. This rentier economy isn't being dealt with as part of this Biden compact, and I hate to tell people it's not something you can just throw money at. Like even MMTers, would make arguments about like you'd have to strategically invest certain areas, you'd have to have a jobs guarantee and all this, and then you start wondering like, well, what's going to propel that? Like, who on earth in power is going to want to make labor that inelastic? See how much they're complaining now with a brief labor shortage, because everyone's not desperate and taking like really low paying jobs, and while prices are going up.
Yeah, I mean, to address, I mean, there was a lot there. The parallels between, I guess, perhaps the shift between world hegemons between, in the past, the UK and the US, versus perhaps today between the US and China, which, it doesn't seem unlikely or certainly not unthinkable. There are some complications to that I think, as the UK was in decline, even though the US was the clear, it was the clearest, possible successor to its sort of world hegemony, its imperial role, within capitalism. It was more of a multipolar order because Germany was also on the up and up at that time. I mean, they suffered a shattering defeat in the First World War, and then even more so in the Second World War, which definitively established the US as the sort of successor to the UK in terms of global hegemon. With today, Russia is fallen, even though really the sort of new Cold War that Biden seems to be embarking upon does include pivots against both China and Russia in terms of deployments and military spending. I think that there is no clear-cut second. There is it's much more clear-cut the second fiddle today in terms of the most powerful imperialist nation between the U.S. and China than it was in Britain at the turn of the century. Germany, might have filled that role if things had played out a different way. The U.S. Was this, sleeping giant at that point. It had a kind of isolationist policy that was mainstream with both political parties that prevented it from kind of playing the sort of world cop that it now plays. But, just given the way that inter-imperialist conflict played out in the world wars, the U.S. filled those shoes, completely after the war. With respect to today, yeah, I mean, it is weird, the sort of FDRism and the sort of lack of a material basis for it. But even like to me, like, and the way that it gets, the sort of, rose tinted glasses of retrospect, the way that people romanticize the New Deal years and even think of like Great Society measures as part of that. Like even at the time, even like a sort of milk toast reformist party like the Socialist Party USA, SPUSA. I remember one of their members got asked in the 30s, like whether or not they were not heartened by the fact that FDR seemed to be carrying out some of their policies that they had run on in the 32 election. And the representative of the SPUSA said something like, yeah, he's carrying them out on a stretcher. Like even like, so I mean, it just shows the sort of shrinking, imagination of like, socialists, even with respect to, like, Keynesian policies, like the New Deal, that now suddenly, for some reason, they appear like super radical. And I mean, they're not even possible, as Maddock, establishes fairly convincingly. The material conditions just aren't there. It would require like a massive destruction of pre-existing value for the conditions that obtained, after the war, to be possible again, for that kind of post-war prosperity to even be remotely, achievable.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the ghost of Heinrich Grossman is kind of here in this, right? Like, the thing I would say is, let's say you took an MMT policy in its absolute most left form, right? Back caps for employment, etc. To maintain that without inflation. And I'm not using a neoclassical model. I'm actually just modeling their own things here. You have to maintain production, at the levels to equal liquidity, or you have to tax to destroy that. If you tax to destroy that, who are you going to tax, right? Well, do you think it would drive people leftward to have a regressive spending tax or a VAT tax right now? I mean, like, particularly something like the VAT, which is beloved by social democrats in Canada and in Europe, partly because it's so good at extracting, it's more efficient at getting people to pay their taxes. It's harder to hide from, but it's also more regressive than standard tax policy, even in the United States. And that's generally ignored. And I don't think that would, like, if you're thinking about this on this kind of myopic left coalition way, most of these policies under the current conditions would have elements that would sour people on them almost immediately. But conversely, when I read a lot of these social democrats, they seem to be talking about, whether or not they're post-leftist or dirtbag leftist or whatever, they seem to be talking about an industrial working class that doesn't really exist anymore in any mass way. I mean, I keep on telling people, like, look at what the number one employers in the country are. It's the military, it's Walmart and Amazon, and it's trucking, logistics, right? Like, those are the biggest employers, and it's like, that isn't anything that you model on this early 20th century workers movement in the same way. That the union organization is possible in that context, but it works very differently. You can't model it off of the classical period of union organization in America. And then you have the whole, like, if Fordism is tried now, and you do get there's a lot of grumbling out of Biden, pushing for Fordist like policies, right? Like encouraging more employment with government stuff.
This is why the left. This is why the left is suddenly gone like completely soft on him. I mean, they did before the election because we have to vote out Trump or whatever. But since then, I mean, sort of like falling head over heels, just praising Biden's policies. This is why.
Yeah, and I find that to be interesting. Interesting in the sense that I have some MMT friends who will say that it's a sign that a lot of these people are really conservative, and with some of these people, sure, they might be becoming conservative and they should just own up to it. But that's not really what I'm worried about with this Neo-Fordist stuff. Is that I don't know how it works with the economy that we have. How do you have a Fordist economy with a bunch of franchises and gig work? Like, what's going to facilitate that anyway? I mean, even if the profit margins weren't low, which in non-rentier parts of the economy they are, what would you base that off of? Like, the dirty secret of the Fordist Compact is when it really took off in the late 40s. And Matik has talked about this, but even like George Kennan, all right, founder of the OSS, his predecessor CIA, was talking about this. We had 48% of the world's wealth as just being the last person standing that didn't have its wealth destroyed. So you had everyone else have their capital set almost to ground zero, right? And we still had stuff, and we could go in to now these new markets as if you had fresh markets where capitalism was barely ever there, and was able to reap the rewards of that
and rebuild Europe, the
right.
Marshall Plan, and all this other stuff that would be unthinkable. Even was unthinkable, with the during the collapse of the actually existing socialist states. Something like, because that Fordist moment had passed, a sort of plan for rebuilding on the scale of the Marshall Plan was unthinkable for Eastern Europe. It was capitalist shock therapy. It was, I mean, they did give some debt forgiveness to Poland and stuff like that, but I mean, yeah, the conditions simply aren't there. And even now, like a generation or so further removed from that, even it's deteriorated even more so.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like people seem to think that you could reindustrialize as an act of will. This is both social democrats and Trumpists, frankly. Like, that was both talking points on both sides. And I would hear Corbyn talk about this more than even Sanders, actually. And I would be like, what base, particularly on the island of the UK, what base would you have where you could act like an autarky and then also reindustrialize with your current population levels and your current use of land and like the US can't, the US can't do it. And if there's any country, there's like 3 countries in the world that could, it would be the US, India, or China, like, and maybe Russia, because of resources. And they can't. None of us have all the resources we need to keep everything currently running by ourselves. Autarky is not possible in this kind of advanced economy. And so this idea that you could just wheel industrialization back into existence seems bizarre to me. Even if you like nationalized all the industries within one country, I don't think you could do it. Nor do I know why you really want to, except for this, nostalgia for a period of capitalist development that I think is somewhat misguided. I mean, like, could the world handle that kind of industrialization right now? Like if we, like what environmental impacts would it have? I don't say this is like a green doomer or anything, but it's something you really have to look at, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just conditions are overripe rather than unripe. Like, and the idea of like turning back the clocks and returning to, I mean, what they're really nostalgic for, and I mean, I guess you kind of went into it. It was a nice quote that Gendler pointed out in your conversation with him, that both left and right seem to be nostalgic for the 50s, in the sense that the right wants to go home there, the sort of idea, leave it to beaver family, nuclear family stuff. The left wants to go to work there, the kind of big union, big labor, collective bargaining arrangement that obtained after the war. I mean, that's what they're nostalgic for. I mean, if anything, I'm nostalgic for a much older period of time, not in the sense of like, I feel like we need to recreate the kind of, the steel workers in Petrograd, like in the sense of like, that kind of industrial phase of industrial development. But in terms of like the kind of collective political and social agency that existed at that time, I mean, that's really like what, in terms of like meaningful transformation of the world is lacking, but it's not going to be regained or recaptured somehow by some sort of crash course like autarkic, industrialization, reindustrialization program. It's just pure fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, so what I see on the left right now is a lot of attempts to deal with this. I could think out. There's so many, actually. I mean, even in some ways, our left communism, and you would be one of the few people that I would say is to the left of me on a lot of these issues. But our left communism is even a little bit of copium on this, to use a popular term on the internet, that we just don't have the capacity right now to fully address all the different things we need to. And I also find it interesting, like, for example, when studying China, and I bring this up a lot with people, when they talk about how massively impressive the Chinese economy is going. Well, I'm like, yeah, it is. It's at 6% growth and has been for about a decade. Although I remember in the late aughts and early aught teens, when all the people in know are like, well, if China drops behind 10% growth, given their population increases, they'll have massive poverty and instability. And that hasn't happened. But what you have seen is China hasn't significantly reduced its Gini coefficient in a long time. And if people don't know what I mean by that, the Chinese Gini coefficient is much higher, as far as inequality, is much higher than the United States, particularly in the peasant areas. So what that tells me is a couple of things. One of the reasons why I think China is taking a more bellicose stance towards the world is, the decline of the current hegemon. But the other reason is I think their own productivity within their own nation is beginning to slow down, and they need new ways to find profits too. And that tension is not just going to primarily or most aggressively probably even show up with the U.S. It's going to show up with like the increased tensions with countries that I don't like particularly right now. I mean, like Modi's India is pretty vile, but you're going to see increased tensions with India. You're going to see, you're probably going to see stuff like the Philippines and the Koreas not know how to address the Philippines, the Koreas, and Vietnam not really know how to address China. And you'll see
Vietnam fears China. They almost would prefer the U.S. And I remember a few years ago they even invited the U.S. to sort of reopen a military base there because of China's encroachment on their portion of the South China Sea. But yeah, I mean, since the late 70s, they've feared China, and historically, obviously, Vietnam has a very complicated relationship with China. I mean, even regionally,
so does Korea, actually.
Yeah, I would say too. I mean, not just internationally or regionally in terms of like China coming into conflict with various other powers that surround them, but also domestically. And I think Lauren Goldner is actually, most of his research these days is on working class uprisings in China. I mean, I do anticipate more labor struggles domestically as they continue to, adopt, at least economically, more Western style, a more Western approach to, continued industrialization, continued economic development.
Right, and Xi has indicated that they will continue to do so, to the chagrin of the neo-Maoists. I mean, like the neo-Maoist code. Neo-Maoism as a tendency in China is actually kind of interesting, because it's because of actually deliberate online outreach programs. It has an extremely nationalistic bent to it, but it does tend to side with some of the labor unrest in China, but while also trying to maintain a pretty orthodox line on Xi and the current direction of the Politburo, which puts them in a really weird place, actually. So they tend to be more useful for geopolitical propaganda outside of China than in it. And they do have a direct line to the Politburo from the people who've studied it. But there's also these other labor unrest going on in China. There's been unrest around the internal passport system and the access to jobs. I mean, particularly people actually followed what was going on at Foxconn. Foxconn, 7-8 years ago, had a ton of illegal labor. It was all Chinese illegal labor. It was illegal labor within China. The people were fleeing rural areas within China itself to Foxconn, and that's been a source of tension. And it was a source of tension that some kind of Asian right wingers were able to take advantage of and agitprop during the beginning of COVID, because there were real responses to that had some real workers' roots. All this is quite complicated, though, and I think one of the things I've learned is what Western leftists don't have a very multifaceted understanding of other countries like China. They tend to view everything in terms of like pro-con agitprop, or the CIA lying about the Uyghurs or whatever, as opposed to actually trying to look at all the complications going internal to a multi-ethnic, huge, booming, by our standards, economy. But a booming economy that's been slowing down gradually for a decade. So it's one of these things that I think people don't really know how to address in most of our models. I'm tempted to quote, that Brumaire line about the past, right? I'm not going to, I'll spare everybody because it gets quoted so much. But our models are kind of aping the early 20th century and not looking at what's going on right now. And why, for example, I mean, there's a bunch of complications when we talk about this Biden foreign policy stuff. I don't foresee Biden, now I could be wrong, because anything I say on this you have to take probabilistically, right? But I don't foresee Biden starting any new wars or venturism in the Mideast. What I see is exactly what you're talking about, which is an increased Cold War, maybe some unofficial proxy wars. And what I've also found interesting about all this is a country that has done the most with that strategy is not the country that you would expect to off of like development. Russia's been able to play this stuff very well. And theoretically it shouldn't. I mean, like, you're talking about a country with the current GDP just a little bit above Italy. I mean, like, not great. But they have been able to play off the tensions, actually partly playing the tensions off of China and the US. So this like multi-tiered world that you remember, like we were talking about in the beginning, like in the 19th century, this great game. And I think I've been telling people to like study that period of time as a better analog to what's going on right now, is partly what's going on. And in the context of this, you've had both the left and the right. And I know a lot of leftists won't realize they're doing this because they talk open borders or whatever. But there's been this methodological nationalism streaming through all this, I think kind of as a response to the failures of neoliberalism, which was never as internationalist as it was painted. But like, I mean, do you see that? Because I feel like everybody has become more focused on nation states and stuff in terms of how they think you should organize all this stuff. And they tend to think economies are like nationally bound.
Yeah, the sort of economic nationalism. And in fact, I mean, to sort of pimp one of my friend's articles, somebody who's both dealt with the issue of left economic nationalism and has devoted, probably, into my mind, the best sort of serious Marxist engagement with MMT is Jamie Merchant, who's written several articles for Brooklyn Rail and The Nation, precisely on these issues. In terms of, I mean, certainly I agree completely with what you said about Russia. I mean, considering the hand that it was dealt after the collapse of the USSR, Putin certainly has played it masterfully, and has really called the bluff of various other. I mean, the U.S., which fresh off of a decade of miserable failures in the Middle East in terms of its policies, they were able to sort of, first of all, annex Crimea and contest the Donbass region, as well as like insert themselves into the Syrian civil war in ways that the U.S. I mean, certainly if Hillary had been elected, I feel like we would have come close to even perhaps nuclear war, if not something much more serious, given her hawkishness and particularly vis-a-vis Assad. But yeah, I mean, Putin has been able to sort of withstand internal challenges completely and expand Russia's bargaining position in terms of like its territorial aspirations and its influence regionally, much further than people would have guessed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I don't know, but yeah, to bring it back perhaps to the topic that you asked me to come talk about, and perhaps like the floundering of the left with Biden. It has been, it goes without saying. I mean, the left's reaction to it, at least the left conventionally understood as most people, people say like, oh, well, Biden represents the left in power. Well, I mean, the people who conceive of themselves as the left proper or whatever, though I would suspect, functionally they are liberals in terms of the way that they block politically when it comes to elections and in terms of the policies that they sort of culture war bullshit that they embroil themselves in, they are liberals functionally. I mean, the left, that at least talks a big game. It's their reaction to Biden has been pitiful, if predictable. I mean, anybody who thought that electing Biden would meaningfully change things, in my opinion, was fucking delusional. And especially if you look in terms of his border policies, he's continuing the same. He's even said that they might, complete the border wall that Trump, set up. Basically, you get various politicians like AOC, beloved of the Social Democrats, speaking out on Biden's behalf, like with these euphemisms about, oh, they're not kids in cages anymore, they're migrant overflow facilities, unaccompanied minors or whatever. Like, it's just transparent bullshit, obviously. And Trump himself was really just continuing the same policies, more or less, perhaps, saying the quiet part loud and being a bit more brazen about it, as the so-called, deporter-in-chief Obama, who preceded him. And Obama, in his first administration, 2009 to 2013, deported more people than Trump did in his entire administration. So even in just a 4-year stretch, to pretend like Trump was this massive departure from politics as usual. I mean, he was an unusual figure. He was an aberration in terms of just what people used to think of as like the limits of respectable politics or whatnot. But those limits were always idiotic anyway. And at least personally, I found his antics entertaining, at least. But regardless, you don't like now, and this is again like just harkens back. To me, when I was living through the anti-war movement in like the 2000s and like was really gung-ho about all that, really my first like major disillusionment with the left was 2007, 2008, when you saw the anti-war movement degenerate into this like one long vegan bake sale for the Obama campaign. Like, even though his stated foreign policy agenda was more or less a continuation of the Bush doctrine, I mean, he said that he wanted to close Guantanamo Bay, but then again, so did McCain. I mean, they both campaigned on closing Guantanamo Bay, and it's still open. And so, I mean, immediately after Obama was elected, the anti-war protests basically, disappeared. Where are the protests against the Biden border policy that you saw these like massive demonstrations against Trump's
Well, the biggest one is because the press was shut off from that, and there was no real big outrage when the press was shut off from a lot of that, even though there were still reports coming out of it. Harris and Biden deliberately actually cut press junket runs and stuff like that had happened under the Trump administration, so they wouldn't have to deal with it. Yes, technically, there is a different policy going on, and its motivations are different. But effectively, if I'm in one of those compounds, I don't see what the difference really is. I will also say there's a lot of talk on the reversal of funding for the border wall, and Biden did immediately do that. However, he's not been winning the suits or even fighting them very hard to get him to continue funding it, up to and including seizures of personal property for the wall.
Mm-hmm.
That's still been going on. So, a lot of people who I'm seeing a lot of people saying, that there was this, that, and the other, and there was, and then it was almost immediate, when the 100 days started winding down and people weren't paying as much of attention, and also there was bad press about the crisis. The crisis. I'm gonna put it in quotation marks so people don't think I'm endorsing this narrative on the border. You saw immediate reversals, or quiet downplaying of those initial policies. In regards to Biden and social democratic reforms, I would ask you, what social democratic reforms have you seen other than an expansion of a Milton Friedmanite tax credit just spread out over 24 months? You are hearing talk of Neo-Fordist policies, but none of those policies has even gotten through the Senate, and most of them can't.
And they won't. Yeah, there's just empty talk. In any case, really, you talked about the copium or whatever, and the reality is that at our present moment, the working class is disorganized and defeated. No one who is honest with himself or herself has the answers to the present impasse. Really, but at least some recognize the problem. And I would say even to give, whatever you want to call them. I personally prefer not to refer to them as the post-left since they don't like that appellation, but or anti-left or whatever they want to call themselves. At least they do seem to recognize that there's some sort of problem. Whereas the left itself, and we can talk about the left, what that is or whatever. They, by and large, have been just sort of, closing their ears. They don't want to hear it for the most part. They'll grumble about it online, but you can expect, come the 2024 election cycle, that they will, begrudgingly throw their support behind whatever Democratic candidate. I don't think Biden's going to make it through to run again. Maybe Kamala, who knows? They will begrudgingly throw their support behind whoever the Democrats put on the ticket in order to stave off the possibility of an even more reactionary Republican, whatever. So,
what's interesting to me about that is there is both a chance of an even more reactionary Republican, I suppose. There's also the fact that there's no clear, the GOP right now is, despite its seeming victory, you wouldn't see people like Newt Gingrich peddling conspiracy theories if they weren't desperate. And so I think what you're seeing right now is a sort of, I remember listening to some leftist on a podcast I won't name because I don't want to call them out, and these are not social democrats, right? But saying that we'll have a united Russia with the GOP in charge, and I'm like, where, I mean, yes, the GOP can gerrymander all these states and whatever, and they're still able to do that because the Biden votes, even though they went towards the Senate, didn't actually go down ballot beyond the national level. Interestingly, there is a real sense in which, like, all the political spectrum in the United States is sort of in low-key crisis. And if they weren't in crisis, you wouldn't get even the peons to social democracy you're getting from Biden. Well, and I shouldn't say social democracy. I should say Fordism. And what he's advocating. So, for example, like the policies that I've seen him advocate, universal access and cheaper access to community college for an associate's degree. What's that going to do? All these policies sound like a Fordist version of kind of policies actually out of the neoliberal area of the Democrats. It's just now the government's willing to like foot some of the bill, as opposed to just ask you to do it yourself. But again, what's it going to do? What's its effect on the economy? And then his framing for this in the last speech, and one of the few he's given, was competition with China. It's a very strange time to see a lot of this get a pass. And I say this because that's even been true for people who were enemies of the centrist Democrats in the past. And on this one, I will name a name. I've seen Doug Henwood, reverse his stance towards that part of the party, or pretty strongly in both social media and in appearances in the last year. And that surprised me. Like, Henwood, for all of his neo-Keynesian rhetoric, had strongly been, suspicious of that branch of the party for what, a decade? You and I have listened to him for that long.
Oh yeah.
And to watch him, fight with other leftists for being critical of Biden was something new. Because I haven't seen anything beyond talk, nor can I game how this stuff gets out of the Senate. Because so far, it goes exactly how you game theoretic would predict it, right? That one senator from West Virginia, and if it's not him, it'll be Kristen Sinema, a person, by the way, who was involved in Occupy. More people need to look at her history. Kristen Sinema, was a darling of a lot of the post-Occupy left until recently. She wrote something like in the middle of the teens about how like she got arrested during Occupy and stuff, and she was like the first bisexual senator, et cetera, et cetera. So what's driving this cannot be simply said to be just like ideological politics that easily. And is it all material? Yes, but what does that mean? Marxists can throw that around without actually doing any real analysis, right? Like, and I think, you and I are less sanguine on. There's a variety of people use the PMC thesis. There's the post left. There's the dirtbag left who don't like the post left, and the post left don't like them. There's the more explicit anti-left people. Anyone, it's just like with left communists, any group, there's micro factions, right? But there is sort of a people responding to like, hey, this is still non-responsive to people's needs. What do we do? But during the entire time, I still think there's this whole refusal to deal with deindustrialization, to deal with the fact that there hasn't been a good way to reinvigorate the union movement. That tactical reinvigorations of the union movement are very small. And yes, while we have seen an uptick in unions, we've only seen it for about 1% and only in new unions. And I say this as a person in a union. Like, I'm not anti-union in any strong way at all. But I just think you have to deal with this realistically. I want to pivot a little bit though, as far as like the left. You mentioned that you write for a lot of left communist magazines. It's actually very hard to get people to talk about left communism, who are left communist, who aren't communizers. And then if you call communizers left communism, like 60% of left communists will get pitchforks and pitchfork at you on Twitter. And I agree, it's technically incorrect, but families of resentment there.
part of the sort of fallout of French ultra leftism. I mean, yeah, I mean, just to because I mean, this is actually a kind of elegant segue, because I mean, really, like the major tendencies that do seem to want to sort of dwell on the problems of deindustrialization and the sort of decline of the union movement as a kind of long-term and irreversible trend are the communizers. I mean, who, to their credit, as much as I disagree with them theoretically for the most part, they do at least try to grapple with that reality. They, of course, attach it to this whole periodization of, Marxian categories of formal versus real subsumption and a kind of, something that is a sort of, ineluctable process that, we, have now left the era of programmatic politics, which is where they draw the ire of, more traditional left communists, and, mass working class parties and, the working class as the revolutionary subject is something that has to be abandoned according to the communizers. I, of course, disagree with this wholeheartedly. I mean, I would, of course, I guess to be clear, I mean, I always tell people that I'm sympathetic to the historical positions of the communist left. I don't consider myself a left communist in the sense that I believe only militant members of left communist organizations can rightfully claim that title. But I've written for publications that are sympathetic to left communism and draw upon that tradition. And the same way, Lauren Goldman is not a member of any left communist organization, but has written for various publications, has been republished by the ICT and whatever. But yeah, I mean, it is difficult, and it is surprising, like the extent to which it's become kind of a meme. I mean, memes are funny. Who doesn't like, throwing up a funny Bordiga meme? But I mean, to actually get to the substance of some of these historical figures and what the implications of their arguments would be in terms of a future politics. But yeah, certainly they have tried to analyze the various defeats of revolutionary movements in the past, and it's interesting to see the way that I mean, obviously Bernie was not, even though he called himself part of a political revolution or whatever, no Marxist at least would call what Bernie represented any kind of revolutionary politics. But nevertheless, in the aftermath of his failure of the collapse of the sort of Bernie movement, there have been various attempts to come to terms with, why did Bernie 2020 fail? And left communists have history of doing this with why did the world revolution fail? Obviously a much weightier and, in my opinion, much more political event.
First as tragedy, then as farce, but go on.
Yeah, a much more meaningful world historic sequence of events than two failed Democratic primary and whatever, like Corbyn's election attempts in Britain. There have been various attempts to kind of reflect on this, I guess, amongst people who supported him at one point. And I guess that's even though it was written before Bernie failed and Corbyn failed, Amber's article gestured in that direction, or at least from what it seems like you're saying, presaged various lines of argument that were later taken up in the wake of their failure.
When I was looking at the revival of the PMC thesis, how do people find this, sort of obscure John and Barbara Ehrenreich work from the 80s that even didn't mean that much hay at the time to kind of, to frankly bridge both some left and some right-wing class theories and try to, in so much that class theories have left and right wing, if you have James Burnham in the background, there's a right wing origin there somewhere, right? But this has been sort of an ongoing thesis that I've seen spread out. But what I also find interesting about the PMC thesis is if you try to pin down what people mean by it, it's different in almost every case. I'll give you an example. Pascal Roberts from This is Revolution, formerly tied, I might still be formally tied to the Black Agenda Report. He talks about the Black PMC, but by PMC, if you ask him what it means, he means professionals with a fiduciary responsibility to their clients. So basically lawyers and accountants, and then managers of large corporations, right? And then everyone else would be petit bourgeois. They're just labor aristocratic parts of the working class. But that's not what most people mean by it. So, like, if you look at what Catherine Liu in her Virtue Hoarders book, in my conversation with Alex, I couldn't even figure out all who she included, and it even seemed to change in the book, like who was there, when, where, and how far back it goes. And she's talking about PMC as early as like the beginning of the 20th century, as if it's been a class with us through capital the entire time. So I find that interesting because it does bespeak that there's something going on that this, memeified class analysis is speaking to, but that no one really actually understands what's going on enough to make a coherent argument for it. And there's a lot of other political motivations behind it, right? And I have seen someone like Elena Lang use left-com-like rhetoric on Twitter and whatever, but propose kind of socially conservative forms of social democracy answers from that left communist kind of rhetoric. And so so there's clearly where they see something like we do, they see a problem. Their answers to it are like night and day different. I mean, I think if you told most of these people that a lot of the reforms they want are out and out, even if you had the electoral coalition, even if you broke through the legal barriers, some of them would still probably not be possible, or if they were possible, would have repercussions that you didn't see. And I know there are people who will talk about the perversity thesis and the futility thesis as essentially reactionary modes of thinking by saying, well, this attempt is futile because you haven't dealt with this other thing, or a perversity is this might work in the short term, but it'll have perverse effects in the long term, i.e. classical Keynesianism as applied after the post-war compact when there's one commodity shock. I mean, the classic example, right, is like stagflation happens because you literally reach, under most metrics, negative profitability in the early 70s after the oil embargo. Mm-hmm. And while yes, oil's like the main commodity for most of the world at the time, if you can't survive one commodity shock, your economy is hyper fragile, right? Like, I mean, and we can even see this in state socialist strategies. Now you look at
Venezuela.
Venezuela, yeah, exactly.
In fact, I mean, people like to say, of course, and the U.S. has been interested in undermining Bolivarianism or whatever since Chavez resisted the coup attempt in 2002, 2003. Of course, the U.S. has tried to undermine him at every turn, despite basically propping up his social programs in practice during the Iraq War by invading the Middle East and driving up the price of oil. They basically, and because they bought so much of their oil from Venezuela, funding half of the Bolivarian policies that then, since his, even before he died, but certainly after he died, have fallen on extremely hard times as the price of oil has plummeted. That's why, because, of the failure of all parties in Venezuela, including Chavez and Maduro, to diversify their sort of mono-commodity export, they, just shows the fragility of their economy. But certainly, I guess, when it comes to like in discussing Amber's article, I mean, again, like I don't want to wade into, I guess, the debate about the PMC, but I feel like one can't avoid it with respect to, and I know that you had a long conversation with Alex about it, and it's certainly much debated. It is curious to me why suddenly this concept has legs. Like I know Adolf Reed was using it persistently, borrowed from the Ehrenreichs. But why it's suddenly become, I guess Reed had a lot of followers and stuff, but I mean, I don't,
Reed had a lot of followers for like 20, for like at least the last 6 years. And we weren't all talking about the PMC thesis. That was like this obscure thing that basically, he, and also like what he means by it is different. That's the thing. Yeah. You can't avoid it though. And what I think is interesting, right? Like, as much as I've been attacking it for the last 2 or 3 months, that rentier economy stuff and that move towards credentialing and all that, that's all very real. And I think what people are ignoring is it's tied into like secular stagnation and the production of like traditional commodities, for example, right? Really does map on all the theoretical debates about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall aside. I'm not making a Marxiological argument here, right? There's 1,000. In fact, I probably will be having people give me 85 versions of why that's true or false, and also they'll be incompatible with each other on the true and false side. But you can see in real commodities, and by real commodities I mean physical commodities, where there are not IP claims, a straight trajectory downward since the reestablishment of neoliberalism. So much so that 7 years ago there was an Economist article about it. And like, if to me the Economist is talking about it, it's real. What I think people get confused on is this rentier stuff, like things that require subscription, IP law, things that require monopoly IPs, etc. They don't work that like a natural capital commodity market. But they do seem to be dependent on it in some way, right? And so we've had this whole apparatus built on this that I don't think anyone, including its designers in quotation marks, really understand.
Yeah, I don't want to deny all colloquial validity to this term, the PMC. I know what people mean when they use that term. It refers roughly, whatever quibbles one might have in terms of like who belongs to it exactly, in terms of those who adhere to this theory. You know what they're talking about. They
mean white collar credential workers.
Yeah, and it refers, especially in this, when it's hurled around, as an epithet, like, it refers to a set of like particularly obnoxious cultural signifiers, that's what Amber and others I think are reacting to. And it's, that's, a perfectly legitimate reaction. But in terms of, you mentioned Catherine Liu, she talks about, well, Marxists will say, technically it's not a class, technically, there are only two class or whatever, but, because of the centrality of the concept of class in Marxian analysis, I feel like I have to insist on this point. Like, is the PMC a class? No, not in the Marxist meaning of the word.
It's a strata, maybe. Like I used to try to use the word PMS, like for which unfortunately had unfortunate connotations, so I dropped it. But like there is something real being talked about here, and it when you see it. There's a family of resemblances there, but when you try to do proper productive class analysis on it, it falls apart.
Yeah, unfortunately, Marx never gave a succinct definition of class. He was beginning to at the end of Capital Volume 3. At this point, the text breaks off. But it's pretty clear from his writings that in modern, that is, capitalist society, class means, one's relation to the means of production, namely a relation of either ownership or non-ownership. Lenin, I pulled up this quote because it's useful. Lenin summed it up in a 1919 article where he said that classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in an historically determined system of social production, by the relation, in most cases fixed and formulated by law, to the means of production, by their role in social organization of labor, and consequently by the dimensions of their share of wealth, which they dispose and their mode of acquiring. So clearly, like the class that someone falls into, it isn't determined by their income bracket, although wealth does tend to accrue to those who both own the means of production and have the spare capital to pay others to work for them. But depending on how one chooses to count, really there are only either two or three like pure classes under capitalism. Lukács, said that basically proletariat and bourgeoisie are the only true pure classes insofar as their entire existence and development is dependent on the implements of modern production. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels, they said, society at present is on the whole more and more split between two great hostile camps, two great classes directly facing each other, proletariat, bourgeoisie. Capital Volume 3, he adds, because of the Trinity formula, he adds workers, classes, workers, capitalists, and landowners, the three great classes of modern society based on the capitalist mode of production. They derive, their money from either wages, profits, or ground rent. The rentier, and maybe some of this, bleeds into that. But even the petite bourgeoisie, like in the strictest sense of the term, is not a separate class from the Haute or grand bourgeoisie and the proletariat. As the name suggests, it's in the name. Like they're part of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, they're a subset of the bourgeoisie that is increasingly proletarianized as they have less and less capital in their hands. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, like they have access to the means of production necessary to reproduce their existence, but they lack the capital to employ others to work those means. It's divided, the petite bourgeoisie, it's divided between upwardly and downwardly mobile portions. A few of them hit it big and become big capitalists. The vast majority of them are proletarianized. Of course, it is, small, the entrepreneurial layer of the bourgeoisie, it is a persistent formation. That's because the crises are always like putting, mom and pop shops out of business. Some workers who've been able to sort of like scrimp and scrounge and save or whatever are able to like buy a company or something, and like they become part of the petite bourgeoisie. Usually it doesn't last. Most businesses don't succeed, but it is a resilient feature of capitalism. But proletarians, again, strictly speaking, the Marxist definition of class, which, I'm a Marxist, so it's the definition that I think is correct. They belong to their class by virtue of their non-ownership of the means of production. They sell their labor power as a commodity, to the highest bidder in exchange for a wage. A further qualification that Marx talks about is that they have to be performing productive labor, but it's also complicated because even those who are out of work, the unemployed, usually are grouped in the proletariat as well as part of the, the reserve army of labor.
And I've seen Maoists try to use the productive labor to mean only directly commodity producing, even though this whole circuit of capital is included in Volume 2. Like anyone who services the flow of capital for a wage is producing productive labor by maintaining social reproduction, by maintaining, there's just all these other things going on in there.
But it's significant that like when Marx and Engels like made this claim about society being sifted into two great classes, like there were, of course, like numerous other social groups in existence, both in Europe and around the world. Like there was a large peasantry trapped in what they memorably dubbed the idiocy of rural life. There was
the peasantry was a class from Marx's perspective.
Oh yeah.
Pretty much doesn't exist anymore.
Basically, you've got like agricultural proletarians, and there was of course the old feudal aristocracy. Both these classes were holdovers for Marx, at least from the Ancien regime, and for him they were destined to die off or shrivel into irrelevance, as basically they did, over the course of the next century after they wrote the manifesto. Strictly, again, like strict definitions. Like Engels pointed out in a footnote somewhere, I forget, that like, pre-capitalist estates and castes are not modern classes in, in the exact sense of the word in terms of relations to the means of production, though you can draw parallels. Bukharin had a section on this in his textbook on historical materialism. But I mean, obviously, and I mean, people who want to, make, counter this and talk about the sort of managerial revolution and, the emergence of this managers as this kind of like, or supervisors or whoever is this like new world historic grouping, will counter these things. And of course, like Marx did refer to, any number of intermediate layers between the two, like pure classes, like the strata,
there's strata, right? And I think, I mean, I've even talked about in some ways, if you use modern sociology, there's better ways to talk about the strata than some of Marxist. However, one of the things about this whole managerial class thesis, the classic thesis by James Burnham, although he's not the only one who proposed it, I've pointed that out before.
Yeah, Bruno Rizzi and others after him, like
Rizzi, even Frederick Pollock proposes a version of it from the Frankfurt School. Like it was in the air.
Administrators, for him.
Yeah, I still, when I look at someone like Farjun and Machover's econophysics, not something that I'm sure I agree with or disagree with, but the bimodal distribution of even income patterns probabilistically fits the Marxist two-class model. Like,
yeah, and I mean, like, really, like, I mean, so the various strata that they identify, like, I mean, they might tend to align with bourgeois or proletarian class interests. Management side tends to side with the bosses. What else is new?
Right. I mean, they get paid to do so. So, like,
I mean, it really just brings up another issue, which is that a person can belong to a class sociologically without necessarily or automatically mirroring that class position ideologically. Like, because, class isn't for Marxism a simply sociological category. It has like an objective or in itself dimension, has a subjective or for itself dimension. And a party that, whose membership is mostly made up of workers can easily subscribe to a bourgeois or petty bourgeois political outlook. I mean, the history of, the non-history of an American labor movement, like,
yeah, pretty much after the even before the going back to the 1890s when the Knights of Labor basically refused to strike. This is a question that I think we should answer. And are proles just working class or working class without property? They're working class without capital, and capital and property get confused in our kind of colloquial discussions of the terms. So, like, if you own a house, that house is unlikely to be productive, nor do you actually generally own it. Usually it's actually owned by a bank. So you do not have full free productive claim to that land, nor can you usually reproduce your own existence on it. Like, it's so you don't have capital from that property. And that's the distinction I think people miss. Sometimes you'll see kind of lay people throw out like, well, one of the things that's distorted the consciousness of the proletariat is home ownership. And okay, maybe there's some vague psychological truth to that because home ownership does tie people into property values and stuff in some kind of way. It is also not true that that's a form of capital in the sense Marx was talking about. Like, you can't reproduce yourself by having a mortgage on a house. Would you agree with that, Ross? I mean, to me, this seems like a pretty basic question, but I just wanted to field it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm interested, like, to get into, like, so you certainly see Amber's argument here as sort of a preview of the sort of, post Bernie, like, what went wrong,
right?
And I mean, Amber's a friend. I mean, we used to talk a lot more before she like made it big with Chapo or whatever. But I respect her. She's a great writer, even if we're very distant politically and always have been. But I'm not. I mean, I can certainly see the similarities between some of her lines of argument and where kind of, you know, what's been termed, the post-left or anti-left has gone with it. But I'm interested to know your reasons.
So I picked this because I told you I wanted a good form of this discussion, not a stupid form of this discussion. As far as the basic article, I could have picked Malcolm Schreiener's article, but I've torn it apart too much. Whereas when I read this article, I was like, I get what Amber's talking about. I don't feel like there's anything to like immediately go for the jugular on in the same way. But it did seem interesting to me that this was basically using a class theory to explain an ideological turn, and one that I think we could see coming. I mean, this kind of article about these tendencies on the left isn't new. They've been coming out since the 80s. I published one myself that's somewhat famous and infamous now, by Mark Fisher. I know the problems. But I have always...
They are real problems, and I mean, Fisher, like, his culturalism aside, identified it, fairly, accurately.
I mean, I think, but there's a perniciousness to that culturalism, and but regardless, I mean, what I see here though is we're seeing a manifestation of something, right? But we're explaining causal power to a manifestation of a problem instead of explaining the problem. And I know you can say that about anything, and it's almost an infinite reduction problem. But like, why did this credentialed thing happen? Why is there a subset of it that has vicious, internal monitoring? And frankly, I think it's kind of arbitrary historically that it's liberal, except that demography is changing. Historically speaking, the same sort of pattern would have been held, in the past as a kind of arbitrary barrier to admittance into the upper strata of workers are even out of the working class by things like whether or not you were a WASP or racial arbitrariness. There's usually some arbitrary factor. So that's interesting, right? But it's not going to explain what set up the conditions for that to happen in the first place. And if you're fight, it's like, to me, it's like this is a way to try to fight a culture war that's a problem on the left, instead of dealing with the class issues that's actually addressing it by trying to say this culture war is a class war, where it's actually kind of interstrata competition. And like if we're being nominalist about non-Marxist class theory, yes, I see what they're talking about, but I also see this in other areas. Like you could actually see this in different kinds of blue collar work, credentialed versus uncredentialed blue collar workers, etc. It's just that most of the left, unquote, are not in areas where that kind of economy is super important. And so I think it's an interesting development that we are seeing. And it is interesting to see, like, this detente on picking sides on cultural issues from businesses effectively end. That's interesting. It's just good or bad. It depends on what you're talking about, but that's interesting, right? And it's not just the other thing is that people seem to think this is only this kind of explanationary thing is only happening on the left, but if you actually follow interconservative ideological batters, they're having the same discussions. The basically the post-liberal left versus the neoconservative left actually kind of mirrors, with gradations, a lot of what we're doing on the left too. Like post-liberal right versus the neoconservative right mirrors what's happening between, like, the old Obama, Clinton, liberals to the various gradations of the left. And so I think you have this whole thing that's happening. If it's happening on both sides, if it rhymes, that to me, that's an indication that, like, yes, there's something going on, but we're not like, neither one of us have an answer to what's going on, and our frameworks are entirely different, yet we're talking about the same things. It indicates to me that we don't really understand the material conditions, to use that vague Marxist canard, that's driving this development, right? And to me, there is something going on in and so many things being put in the rentier economy, and the fact that now that outsourcing has ended, a lot of jobs didn't come back. So like one of the trends that started in the early, in the early aught teens, right, was this return of manufacturing to the United States, but it had no corresponding bump in jobs. Because these factories were like so heavily automated, what used to take 500 workers now takes 30. From the classical Marxist perspective, you've decreased socially necessary labor time super low, so you don't need a lot of employees. And if we weren't under like capitalist conditions, that would actually be a good thing, right? But it's not right now. And so you have all these people flooding into professions and the increasing of credentialing. The other thing is credentialing keeps people out of the job market and can keep the appearance of unemployment low. That I think actually is almost explicit policy. Most of this I think is accidental, but that, David Blacker's work about 7 years ago, The Declining Rate of Learning, goes into this in a fair amount of detail, that, there has always been a push to increase credentialing as a kind of arbitrary way of sorting employees, but also to keep people out of the job market and to delay entering the job market to later and later ages. And if you look at the average entry into a full-time job, right now, it's somewhere between 26 and 28 years old. Like, that's new, and that would be driving a lot of this. And I've read a lot of PMC articles that kind of hint at some of these problems and like almost see them, and then cut away to the HR departments, run by these liberals who are trying to rule the world through shaming us all or whatever, and I'm just like, there is something there, and yet it's also missing something hard, because I think, from our kind of perspective, it means that a lot of traditional social democratic or reformist or like Bernieist, workerist, Keynesian Marxo hybrid. That's a hybrid that I never thought made sense, but people believe it.
Paul Sweezy basically adhered to it, but
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's not unheard of, but yeah, I do think, substantially you're right. Like, there are echoes of the current, whatever you want to call them, post-left, anti-left, whatever, of the sort of older, rhetorical tropes that they had been employing when they were essentially united behind Bernie, before the collapse in March, April of last year. And there began to be a sort of reckoning or whatever. And that's when there began to be this rift, I guess, that opened up between, what became known over the summer as the post-left or whatever.
Which you mentioned, the post-leftists don't like that epithet. And I don't want to imply that like Amber would think of herself as a post-leftist, but I can't tell if what the post-left, by that which we mean like the Bellows and like Amy Therese, actually likes it. They were calling themselves that at the beginning of the summer. I don't know what they're calling themselves now.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like, I hesitate to talk about the post-left as if it were a coherent tendency because, well, first of all, they themselves, they themselves resist this label. Some prefer anti-left, others prefer not to be categorized at all. No logo, we don't want a label or whatever. Mostly, they just seem to think of themselves as a group of ideological misfits of various stripes with a range of allegiances. Sometimes you see them refer to our little corner of Twitter or whatever, but for the most part, like, from what I can tell, this, sort of nebulous grouping seems to consist of, assorted economic populists and burnouts from the anti-IDPOL wing, anti-ID-Pol wing of the Bernie campaign. Of course, now they've sought to distance themselves from that former position, and now they sort of tirelessly antagonize the whole, Jacobin social democratic crowd, the Brunigs, the dirtbags in Chapo, Adolf Reed, even since he, I guess came out criticizing Angela Nagel or whatever. They've just, completely, sought to cast off that former allegiance. But, in my opinion, personally, it's hard to criticize the post-left, partly because it's hard to hit a moving target.
Right.
The majority of these people, were uncritical Bernie supporters until the beginning of last summer, or they just thought he should return to more of his 2016 rhetoric or whatever. That seems to be, the substance of the article is that he should have stuck to his 2016 platform. He embraced like identity politics bullshit, which to an extent he did, and whatever else, and that's why he lost. But since then, since they sort of dropped, since the end of Bernie in the summer of 2020, they've sort of superficially assimilated elements of left communist criticism, denouncing, for example, the left wing of capital, which is, a stock phrase from, the communist left that I'm sympathetic to. And really, this is when I, first became aware of their existence, even because, comrades of mine in the international communist tendency, were horrified that these random accounts were posting links to, leftcom.org articles, while at the same time upholding all these, retrograde views about borders and about, the institution of the family or whatever. So my friend Lucas Bordeaux, ICT militant, took to Twitter toward the end of last summer to clarify that, these people weren't left comms, they were just, reactionaries. And really, like, confusingly, for me at least, even when, they were still sort of normie Bernie stands, like, some of them began, posting Bordiga memes, which is just, like, insane to me, because really, like, Bordiga strikes me as, like, this sort of, like, nightmare, like, almost caricature of what anti-communists fear the most. Like, he upheld staunchly, the Marxist doctrine of the abolition of the family, not just the bourgeois family, but the abolition of the family as such, as one of its invariant principles. Like 5 or 6 separate articles, he says exactly this, along with the destruction of all forms of property, the state. And like, it's also funny to me too, that like, when you bring this up, they'll say like, oh, well, you're just, being undialectical dogmatist, like, while still invoking Bordiga, who's like the most dogmatic of all communists. There's that great line. There's that great line Bordiga has in The Spirit of Horsepower, where he says, damn those who talk about dogmas. There has yet to be a renegade who didn't use this word. Mao compared it with cow shit. Well, bon appetit. Like, I'm a dogmatist. Fuck it. I'll eat it. Like, and it really, like, it's, I don't know. It really sucks. Like, Amy Therese, who you mentioned, like, that, her account recently got resurrected. It sucks that she's deprived of her platform. I don't know what the latest reason is that they would say that she got suspended. It's undoubtedly bullshit. But I mean, one of the funnier things, like, of her recent account resurrection was that, it showed all of her sort of normie Sochdem posts, like, from like barely over a year ago. Like, in the last couple of months, like, she's gone on about unions counter-revolutionary character, like, still upheld them as like bastions of working class power. Like, I didn't even realize like, because I only became aware of it like September 2020, like how rapid the shift in these people's outlooks had been. So like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I mistrust those who, radically revise their views every few months. Everybody, of course, is entitled to,
Or every few
change his or her
conversations.
opinion. Yeah. Everybody's entitled to change their opinions, whatever. I do give them some credit in at least trying to like process the failure of Bernie as misguided and wrong as I think the reasons they think that Bernie lost was. But I mean, like, again, like most of the left today just wants to close its ears, pretend that everything's fine, that they were, things were right all along. We just need to keep doing the same old thing. But like, there were also people like me, like you, various left communists who, the cranks that I associate with, who, we always viewed the Bernie campaign as doomed. Like we're still even if like we believed, like I believe that even if he had somehow miraculously been elected, even if the DNC didn't torpedo his campaign or whatever, or even if he didn't self-sabotage, however one wants to think of it, he would have inevitably betrayed, the promises that he made on behalf of working people.
He wouldn't have had the electoral power to do it, nor would he have the funding power to do it. I mean, like, and when you would point this out to people, they would look at you like you were insane. And I was like, I'm literally just explaining high school civics and coalitions to you, like Bernie won't be a Bonaparte. You're not going to have a Bernie part. Like that's not how the United States, is set up. Nor do I see Bernie suspending the Constitution or something like that. Like, come on. There was always this amount of like projection, and I remember like I haven't discussed this with Adolf Reed Jr. personally. But I remember when Adolf Reed did that thing where, Bernie was to build the coalition for the workers' movement anyway. And I was like, well, that's circular. Like, you couldn't have got Bernie without the workers' movement, right, in quotation marks. Like,
as if Bernie, like, represented an ascendant, like, labor militant movement. Ridiculous.
Yeah.
I liked, something you said in conversation with Gendler that, the problem with the so-called, class reductionists is often that they aren't class reductionist enough. One of my other friends, a member of the Gulf Coast Communist fraction, he recently remarked about the milieu around the bellows that, these clowns aren't even worthy of the class reductionist pejorative. Like,
no, they're really not.
Yeah, I mean, I've never personally liked the charge of class reduction because 9 times out of 10, it's just something that liberals throw at Marxists. And if anything, really, it's the structure of our present economic system that reduces all of our relations to class. Or, Marxists, they've never claimed that class is the only factor, either.
No.
Like, it's just that it's the decisive factor. Like, capitalism is a social totality in which class offers the only vantage from which, its manifold contributions can be overcome. So it's not that it's, various other factors, race, gender, whatever,
and they also emerge in a class context. To me, what's interesting is it emerges in a class context too, and like liberals kind of talk about it, and then don't at all, because it also becomes clear that like you can't generalize trends to entire races, and like demography is not destiny for the Democratic Party, etc., etc. Like,
yeah, I get the guy who said that they aren't don't even deserve the pejorative of class reductionists is. I think planning to write a critique of the bellows from a left communist, from their sort of like left communist perspective, critique of that, which I do look forward to reading, but we'll see. I don't like. I'm not sure. I didn't honestly pay enough attention to the Bernie campaign to say whether or not. To me, like the logic of electoral politics is misses the point anyway. I guess I follow the headlines maybe, but I didn't know enough about the sort of internal debates within the Bernie camp to really say, this is why he lost, or he should have listened to, this wing of the DSA or whatever. I'm not interested really in what the DSA does, because it doesn't, to me, represent a viable politics. But
I mean, also, like, even if it was, when people call it a mass movement, I just kind of laugh, because I'm like 100,000 people in a country of 300 million is like, I don't know,
drop in the ocean.
It's like it's like a neighborhood. It's like maybe like 5 blocks in New York City. I mean, like seriously, it's not. It is something you could drown in a bathtub. I'm even thinking like special interest political groups tend to be much larger in mainstream politics, like than 100,000 people. It's just that, the horizon has been shrunk so far since the new left that's what people tend to think. But there's also this tendency, and maybe this will pivot us away from, maybe into the longer durée that we've kind of hinting at, we hinted at the beginning, to think, oh, well, the new left is what ruined it. I think Mike McNair is always throwing that out. And I'm just like I said, I'm writing this book on Christopher Lasch, not a figure of the communist left by any stretch of the imagination, but like
an intriguing figure. I mean, I read him 10 years ago. Had a rather conservative bent, especially later in his life. But intriguing later intellectually, comes out of intellectually very, very interesting. Out of a sort of Freudian Trotskyist, background.
Right.
Very perceptive of some.
Yeah, I totally agree. And particularly his early works, he talks about how the new left is actually a result of these compromises made after the death knell of the Socialist Party of America and he dates it to the 30s, not to Shachtman, not to Harrington, all the way back, even though he also writes polemics against Harrington and mentions Shachtman and mentions a lot of the people who kind of were frankly on the payroll indirectly of the OSS in the 50s. Like, he goes after that, but it's just an interesting thing to see that even someone from like kind of the kind of conservative-ish social democratic bent saw these problems in the 60s as going back to the origins of the left in America.
Yeah, I mean, I would date it back even further, obviously. Like, left communists, they tend to see things as having gone wrong after with the third Comintern Congress, so 1921. Like, and Goldner even has like he has some line about how you can sort of tell people's entire like political worldview based on when they date the revolution as having gone wrong. Like, if it's like 27 with when Trotsky was expelled, if it's like 23 with the shift to the new economic policy, if it's 21 with the adoption of the United Front, if it's like 1919 with the failure of the Spartacist revolt, like, or even back further, 1914 with the betrayal of international social democracy, the voting for war credits, like.
Yeah, my own personal politics vary between 1914 and 1921. So
yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, it all sucks. Like, right. And it's been more than a century of just like kind of revolution and defeat. Like, I think that is something that one has to come to terms with. I mean, like, yeah, it's funny, like, given both of our organizational pasts, like, that some of this, like, post-left stuff or anti-left, whatever, does seem like vaguely reminiscent of platypus stuff. It's dumber. It's a lot dumber. Like, it's like, I mean, Catrone, I listened to like his conversations with Doug Lane and whoever else, and like various members of platypus, though some of them are, I find, more annoying in terms of their online posting habits or whatever, often which ape a kind of like a sort of stock set of like phrases or takes or like provocations or whatever. They're at least interesting. They at least like they're one can disagree with them, whatever, but they're not idiots. Like, whereas like I find very little redeeming or interesting, or even worthy of consideration, with except like again my interest like in in even like attacking or talking with this sort of bizarre online tendency, was really just to say like your perspective in no way accords with that of the historical communist left, because that is something that I value and think is a legacy worth defending. Um, that I wanted to dissociate it from what I frankly thought of as a bunch of online morons. So whatever.
Yeah, I mean, uh, there will be no end to online self-inflicted obscurantism. Like there's it's an infinite resource, unfortunately, and it's not tied to direct commodities unless you quit giving people food.
So we could probably take questions now if you want.
Yeah, let's take a few questions, and then we'll wrap this up because we're actually probably about 45 minutes longer than originally expected. See if there's any already in here. They're fighting about stuff. Streams are fun to read. Do we have any questions? Don't get one soon. I'm gonna let Ross get back to his evening. You've been warned. So I guess is guard labor productive?
What do you mean guard labor?
Like prison guard labor? No, I don't think so.
No. It performs a function on behalf of the capitalist state, but I mean, it's not.
Yeah,
it's not productive.
It's not. It doesn't seem to service even indirect circuit of capital stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't produce surplus value. And perhaps like serves to maintain a population that does produce surplus value, but it doesn't itself produce surplus value.
Yeah, I would say that it's a very obscure relationship to even social reproduction. I mean, it's so hard to see, other than maybe general social discipline, how it would act, and it would seem somewhat parasitic. What about in private prisons? In so much that private prisons underpay and are not subject to a real wage if they're using prison labor, either under that nice little clause in the 13th Amendment that makes a prison labor, conscripted prison labor, i.e. crypto slavery, legal, then no, it's not part of the circuit of capital. It's a different form of production. I mean, it is part of like primitive accumulation of it's part of primitive accumulation of finished product, but it's not the same thing. It's not part of that.
Yeah, somebody asked about Matt. I know this is completely off topic and it's just involving other podcasts, but somebody mentioned Matt Christman, and strangely enough, especially since I knew Amber before she was on Chapo, like I'd never listened to Chapo until the last few months, and I do find Christman's various rants very entertaining, even though I suspect that we disagree on a lot of things politically. I do like his. He does some collaborations with Sean from Antifada. History is a Weapon, I think, that I've not listened to, but I listened to his podcasts on Prestige TV, The Sopranos. He talked about, guess the X-Files now. I want him to do Justified, because I do find that fun. But again, this is. Wait.
Yeah, I think I would say Chrisman's always interesting me because he's the only one of the Chapo people I think that like seems to come to positions that do seem actually tangential to left communism. They're not left communists, but they're close, and he comes to it kind of
sui generis.
Yeah, sui generis, kind of through ranting. I mean, but I don't understand his politics all the time. I've heard him. Like he did a discussion that was framed as a debate with some MMTers, and I hate to say it, but he didn't do that well, because he didn't really understand how to parse his terms. I have listened to some, but not all the stuff he's done with Sean from Antifada, and I think his stuff on like the decline of small farms and that end of that part of the petit bourgeois, slash I guess remnants of peasantry, that weird overlap there. That he knows his stuff there, and that's actually interesting. This is, I think, an actual directly relevant question. What does it say about our current ideological moment that right deviationists are holding up left com thinkers? I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, but
yeah, it wouldn't be the first time. And there were moments of overlap, even between Trotskyism and right wing. I mean, thinkers, left communists who.
There are left communists who were close to the Mussolini faction.
Yeah, Siliga and others became fascists. Like it's happened. And I mean, most of this, though, I would describe just to the idiocy of the internet, which is its own thing.
Okay, so we have some more. Let's see.
What do I mean by left communism?
Yeah, what do you mean by left communism, or what is left communism for our audience? And I'm just going to out. Erica is a left communist, so
yeah,
I'm sure
she should give. Yeah, no, she should. No, I mean, she could probably even give a better definition than us. But I mean, for me, at least, when I use the term, refers to just a group of positions or seeing some line of continuity with the historical positions of the communist left, for groups like the International Communist Tendency and the International Communist Current, that seems to involve some sort of synthesis between the Dutch, German, more council communists or councilist positions, from the left of the Comintern in the early 20s through the 30s, and the Italian Borghese positions. Of course, also usually grouped into there is the various ICPs, not the Insane Clown Posse, but the ICPs of Italy. There are several, I think, mostly grouped around different publications that are more in line with the positions of Bordiga, whereas the ICT certainly is more sympathetic to one of his comrades, Honorato Dahmen, who split from Bordiga in the mid-50s.
Right. And so one thing we don't include in left communism generally, although I am sympathetic to parts of it, are things like post PCI, PSI, Autonomia, and Apparismo, even though it has some left communist adjacent thoughts. I also am iffy about including situationism in the left communist tradition, although that's a more open debate.
Yeah, I mean, those streams kind of merged with, even some like post Victor Serge streams, like in France, with left communist currents via Jacques Camat. But I mean, it's again, there is no Comintern to be the left of anymore. It really is a sort of a set of historical, sympathies. I think that implies certain positions today. To be sure, I mean, it's not like they're devoid of politics or devoid of stances on current events or anything like that. It's just that that's where the appellation comes from.
Yeah. So I know it can be often confusing because we also talk about like left oppositionists, and that generally tends to be Trotskyist and post-Trotskyist, and we'll talk about.
Yeah, there's also controversy about certain brands of heterodox Trotskyism that seem to verge later upon left communist positions. like Grandiza Muniz, who spoke at Trotsky's funeral, who was close with Natalia Sedova and Victor Serge to an extent, arrived later in the late 40s and 50s, split from the Trotskyist International, and seemed to arrive at some criticisms of unions that were along the same lines as, the Italian left communists and the Dutch German currents. But that's actually a matter of some contention.
Someone asked what I find inspiring from left communist tradition. I will say I do not consider myself left communist. I actually consider myself on the post Comintern spectrum. I am to the left of the Comintern, but actually not as far left as most of the historical left communist traditions would have been. So I don't claim the moniker for myself, even though I tend to agree with a lot of their points. But as far as who I read, I take a lot from the Dutch councilist tradition. I like Boerdega, but also I will admit certain things in Boerdega scare the crap out of me, to be honest. So
some of it is very dark, and it is like, I mean, one thing I do find kind of interesting, I mean, in terms of like the Trotskyist, like, because before I really dove into reading left communist authors, I was most sympathetic with various forms of heterodox Trotskyism.
That's why we know each other.
Yeah, someone like Trotsky was able to, in Mexico City, become quite close friends with Otto Rula, who was one of the famous abstentionists. Opposed the war. With in World War I, he was like Liebknecht. He was a representative in the German government. He was imprisoned for it. And he, of course, famously opposed the Bolsheviks. But Rula and Trotsky collaborated on a sort of abridged edition of Capital with I do respect the sort of ability to separate the personal from the political in that sense. And I would say even that I don't bear any ill will towards these various figures who I criticize. I mean, like, depending on how like capacious one wants to think of this post-left moniker, so I've seen people talk about Anna Khachiyan and like Angela Nagel in it. Angela Nagel, like, at least as far as I could tell, she wrote, her case against open borders, from the left, like, a left case against open borders. So, one imagines that she, at least at that time, thought of herself as a leftist. I bear no ill. Anna Khachiyan, very funny. I knew her actually from, not personally, but intellectually. Like, she wrote on architecture, and I'm very interested in the Soviet avant-garde and whatnot. I find her takes, though offensive often, at least to be kind of funny. Whatever. I'm not offended personally by any of it. And Angela seems to be a very nice person. I know Sean from Antifada said he got drinks with. I ran into her after Damage Mag issue release, and we got along fine. Like, I told her about my article criticizing her stance on borders, and she said actually that it was the most intelligent criticism that it received, and whatever. No, I was upfront about it. I have nothing against her personally. It's a political disagreement. I don't, the various others online, who seem to stand these figures a lot. Like, I don't know any of them, so whatever. I have no beef really with any of them.
I will not claim that. So I have very little beef, but Angela in particular, and I had a pretty hard break, and I do think I will say that I think Angela has been a nationalist for a long time. I do think, however, she's thought of herself as a left nationalist.
Yeah, and I mean, her positions are not inconsistent with, like, the right wing of social democracy, which traditionally is grouped on the left. I mean, we could talk about
right. Yeah, although I'll bring out my Zeev Sternhall and make some things about that spectrum, about where the right wing of social democracy ends and then a bunch of other things start. But yes, it is on the right end of the left. However, Pangloss
Murphy is right that various left parties, communist parties, have opposed immigration in the past. Australia, even more recently in Denmark. It's not uncommon, and that's what I tried to show in the article that I wrote, was that it was ridiculous to call her like a fake leftist or a Strasserist or whatever, simply because these positions aren't unheard of and are consistent with a certain social democratic or social democracy in one country logic. Whatever. It's just I disagree with that position and think that a communist position entails the destruction of all borders through proletarian revolution. But I mean, that's neither here nor there.
I wrote a criticism of that article, which is mainly that she exempted the part of the Marx quote that actually makes it mean the opposite of what she said. But whatever. What I will say is I do think we get absconded in the personalities way too much and go, oh my God, on Twitter drama. Like, I kind of gleefully take pride in the fact that I barely know who's insulting who for whatever day of the week it is. But I will tell you, as far as that's going to go, Twitter drama is a great marketing strategy and it's free. And that's why people do it. So, the other thing, let me see. We'll answer a few more questions.
I mean, I don't have a podcast, and I don't run a publishing house, so whatever controversies one wants to throw at me, I don't give a shit. But whatever.
Yeah, I do have a public podcast. I don't run a publishing house, but I work for one, so there's more stuff there. How does capitalism fit into the international world that we live in now? I use that critique of local community movements.
So councilism refers very specifically to Soviets, to workers' councils, soldiers' councils. I mean, it's a specific political form that emerged in the 1905 revolution in Russia that expanded, in 1917 and the various revolutions that followed, not just in Russia, but Hungary, Bavaria, etc. I don't think it's analogous to sort of just your local communities or like town hall meetings or whatever,
or even syndicates or syndicalism. It's not analogous to that either.
Yeah. I mean, it's different. Like, I mean, whether or not like a future manifestation of workers' power would necessarily take the form of councils in the sense of like 1905 style Petrograd Soviet, like that's a question that I think can only be answered by a successful proletarian revolution. But it would involve certain features of workers' democracy that I think have emerged historically in the Paris Commune and beyond.
All right. Why has the rural-urban divide intensified in recent decades? Explanations are often descriptive and lack material analysis. Rural labor, that real commodity thing I was talking about? Well, rural labor is dependent on the production of real commodities that are relatively raw and don't have as much finishing going into them. And so they have been immiserated. And there's not much, I do think in the terms of like bourgeois politics, there's not much that speaks to them because they're also a smaller and smaller portion of the population. They're not a big voting bloc anymore. So you'll see a lot of that. And the other thing I would say is the suburban or exurban tension that's called rural probably comes from deindustrialization, because a lot of those places were like factory towns out in the middle of nowhere. And that's probably driving a lot of it. I mean, that's a very basic material analysis, but it seems to explain a lot of what I see. Do you have any addition before I flash on this question?
No, I've got nothing to add. And in fact, I should probably get going because I do have papers to grade and whatnot.
All right, yeah. Those of us who teach must. I actually do too. Thank you guys. Thank you guys in the chat. Thank Ross. Ross, this is obviously available live right now. There'll eventually be an audio form of it, probably, that people who don't want to sit and watch you on YouTube with Diogenes in the background can listen to. And we'll call it a night.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was great talking again.
It's great talking to you again. And
yeah, we'll be in touch, and
yeah,
we'll have to do something with a Moog over the summer.
Yeah, we should. I'm hoping to get a Moog back on. A Moog is it amused me when you told me that he was hanging out with you, because I was like, ha. But anyway, good night.
Great guy. All right, see you.
See ya.